Good evening. It is wonderful to see you all here. I am Susan Grew, the Director of Programs for the Newport Beach Public Library. And on behalf of the Foundation, I am pleased to welcome you to our wonderful author lecture series, Library Live. This series is funded by private contributions as well as by the membership of the Foundation. We would like to extend a special thank you tonight to our Library Live sponsors. They are Chris and Debbie Gall, Karen Kuhl-Jacobi, the Pacific Life Foundation, Jack and Katie Scholerman, Dr. Tom Staple, and Sam and Tammy Tang. Also, our local bookseller, Laguna Beach Books, is here tonight to sell books. Thank you. Books are available for purchase, and Mr. Nguyen will be signing them at the conclusion of this program. For those of you who are currently Foundation members, I thank you for your support and for helping to make this night possible. For those of you who are not yet members, let me tell you a little bit about us. The Newport Beach Public Library Foundation raises funds and purchases materials to support this wonderful Newport Beach Public Library. If you have ever come into one of our library branches and found a brand new best-selling book available for checkout, or if you have gone online to access the library's databases in order to do in-depth research or to take a computer tutorial from the comfort of your own home, then you have been the recipient of what the Foundation provides to the library and to this community. All of you are, of course, also recipients of the Foundation's works tonight by attending this event, which is just one of the many quality programs we provide throughout the year. Funds from the Foundation have been used to purchase the very chairs that you are sitting in tonight as well. Our work is completely supported by you, the members, and outside donations. By becoming a Foundation member, you become part of a group that directly supports this library and the services that it provides to our community. Please join us today if you are not already a member. Membership forms are available in the back of the room in the hallway and are also available online on our Foundation website. Also in the hallway, you will find information on our upcoming events. Some of our events include our Witty Distinguished Lecture Series, which will feature Joe Nocera, the New York Times columnist, in March, and the Dr. Wade Davis and the author Isabel Wilkerson, and they are both coming on two different weekends in April. We also have two more Library Live events similar to this one, and I ask that you refer to our website and to our newsletter that's coming out soon to get more information. And of course, if you are a Foundation member, you will get special email notice and discounted ticket prices for these events. As many of you know, our events sell out quickly, as you found out tonight, so be sure to get your tickets now. The Foundation is proud to present programs that inspire people to think, to read, and to act. And tonight's program certainly fits that bill. If I had another 15 or 20 minutes, I might be able to give proper tribute to tonight's speaker introducer, Dr. Linda Vo. Not wanting to cut into our speaker's time, however, I will simply say that Dr. Vo's accomplishments and standing in the Vietnamese American community is eclipsed only by our esteemed speaker. Dr. Vo is the former chair and a current professor in the Department of Asian American Studies in the UC Irvine School of Humanities. She is the director of Viet Stories, which is UCI's Vietnamese American Oral History Project. And in 2015, she was named by the Orange County Register as one of the most influential people in Orange County. Most recently, Dr. Vo was given the Public Image Award by the group the Asian Americans Advancing Justice for her leadership in and advocacy for the Vietnamese American community. Having Dr. Vo here tonight is a symbol of the growing partnership between the Library Foundation and UC Irvine, which is a world-class university with a faculty to match, and that is located right here in our backyard. I am proud to welcome Dr. Linda Vo.
Thank you so much, Susan, and the Newport Beach Public Libraries Foundation, and all of you here tonight. Tonight we'll be talking not about UCI so much, about USC, which is Viet's, where he works right now. It's really a privilege and an honor to be here to introduce someone who I've known for over 20 years. He's been a friend and a colleague. And as long as I've known him, he's never shied away from controversial subjects, but he continually grapples with recognizing there are no simple conclusions to be drawn, and you can see this process in all of his works. And what really makes him unique is his ability to surprise us. I've always known that he has this sharp, witty critic of literature and of arts and culture, but I also know that he has a captivating imagination. But what I've learned in this past year since he's won the major prize is how funny he actually is. And it's really hard to be funny when you write about war and refugees, but somehow he's able to capture that. And if you've read the book, you know what I'm saying when I say that I can never eat squid in the same way ever again. It used to be one of my favorite dishes. So Viet received his PhD in English from UC Berkeley, and he's a professor of English and American Studies and Ethnicity at the University of Southern California. And I've always known him as a professor, but he's added some recent titles to his name. He's now a novelist and he's a short story writer. His first nonfiction book, Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America, is a very influential book in English and also in the field of Asian American studies. His first novel, The Sympathizer, as you well know, won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize in Fiction, and it's won a whole list of other prizes, and I'd be here all night long if I had to say them all. He's written published just recently as well, a second nonfiction work, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memories of War, and that is receiving accolades as well. And then just recently, I believe this month, his latest collection of books has come out. It's a short story collection called The Refugees. And so clearly, this is a man that never sleeps, right? So in the last year or so, he's been able to do something that's very, very rare, to publish acclaimed books in both fiction and nonfiction categories. And his skills is really to take academic jargon and discourse, and with his refined skills, he's able to transform them, transform these ideas so that they can be read by the larger public in fiction form. He's doing op-ed writings, he's doing online writing, and as well as doing television interviews and giving book talks and teaching his classes and writing a next novel. So he's a man that never sleeps. And what makes this really impressive is that there are combined hundreds of books, films, documentaries on the Vietnam War. It's been 40 years since the end, supposedly, of this war. And so for him to get this recognition at this time is very impressive. And if you look at the iconography and the historiography of the Vietnam War, you can see that there's still disagreements regarding when did this war start? What do we call this war? When did this war end? Who was fighting who? What would have happened if this war was prolonged? And what is the impact of the anti-war movement? And really importantly, what are the lessons from this war that we take away? And these are the issues that we still grapple with today. So these are the issues in his books that Viet wrestles with, and he tries to grapple with the lasting legacies of this war and the contradictions of foreign intervention that shaped a civil war that divided families, communities, and nations. So he has profoundly shaped the perceptions of empire and war, but also of Vietnamese and Vietnamese Americans with all its complexities. And he reminds us that the process of remembering, recollecting, recovering, and representing the past involves hauntings and contestations. So please help me welcome Dr. Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Good evening, Newport Beach. I'm gonna do this. Sorry, I'm Asian. I have to. The rest of the night will be spent debunking stereotypes, but I thought I'd start with one. It's really a pleasure to be here in Newport Beach. This is actually probably the most extended amount of time I've spent in this city, and it's been cool so far. Literally cool. What I'm going to do tonight is to talk a little bit about my career as a writer and my autobiography, because my autobiography as a Vietnamese American and as a Vietnamese refugee has been completely intertwined with the history of the United States since the 1960s and onwards into the present. And it's certainly an autobiography that has made me into the writer that I am today. So let me start off really quickly with just a couple of paragraphs from the book Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of Boer, memory of Boer, that's a Freudian slip, the Memory of War, because it'll tell you a little bit about me and how I'm approaching this project of writing. I was born in Vietnam, but made in America. I count myself among those Vietnamese dismayed by America's deeds, but tempted to believe in its words. I also count myself among those Americans who often do not know what to make of Vietnam and want to know what to make of it. Americans, as well as many people the world over, tend to mistake Vietnam with the war named in its honor, or dishonor, as the case may be. This confusion has no doubt led to some of my own uncertainty about what it means to be a man with two countries, as well as the inheritor of two revolutions. Today, the Vietnamese and American revolutions manufacture memories only to absolve the hardening of their arteries. For those of us who consider ourselves to be inheritors of one or both of these revolutions, or who have been influenced by them in some way, we have to know how we make memories and how we forget them so that we can bring it back to life. That is the project, or at least the hope, of this book. In many ways, that's been the project of my writing, the hope of my writing as well, to try to make sense of the history that has produced me, to try to make sense of my relationship to two different countries that have been at war and now seem to be intent on reconciliation. So Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, I really try to investigate this problem of what Vietnam means. Because in the United States, when we say Vietnam, what Americans really mean is the Vietnam War. And when Americans say the Vietnam War, what they really mean is the American war. That is, the war that has concerned Americans and not really the war that has concerned Vietnamese people of all backgrounds. And for me, when I came to the United States, I was 4 years old. I was a refugee. And I ended up in a refugee camp in Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. There were 4 refugee camps in this country where the Vietnamese refugees were sent. Another one was Camp Pendleton. And from there, refugees were dispersed across the country. And my memory begins in that refugee camp. And my memory begins with being separated from my parents when I was 4 years old and sent to live with a white sponsor family. And so my identity has always been wrapped up with what it means to be a refugee, and implicitly, and then explicitly, what it means to be someone who's fled from a war. And as I grew up here in the United States, what I was really aware of was that how the Vietnamese remembered this war differed radically from how Americans did. Eventually, we moved to San Jose, California. My parents opened the second Vietnamese grocery store in that city. And I grew up watching my parents suffering and enduring the typical kinds of experiences that refugee and immigrant shopkeepers have to go through. But I also was immersed in the life of the Vietnamese community there. San Jose has one of the largest Vietnamese populations in the country. And I grew up listening to the stories of Vietnamese people. And these people, without an exception, had lost their country. Many of them had lost their relatives. They had lost their identities. They had lost their careers. They had lost their prestige. They had lost their status. And they had come to this country with nothing or almost nothing, and they had to start over. And their stories were suffused with sadness, pain, bitterness, melancholy. And the irony of it was that the American stories reflected none of this. The American stories, I'll tell you, when I was growing up, I was obsessed with war, and especially the Vietnam War. I watched every movie, I think, that Hollywood made about the Vietnam War, which is an experience I do not recommend anyone undertake, except a scholar or a little, boy who was a war fanatic. But what was obvious was that these movies were completely focused on what Americans went through and not what happened to the Vietnamese. Despite the fact that although there was this tremendous tragedy where 58,000 plus Americans lost their lives, 3 million Vietnamese people lost their lives. And most Americans have no comprehension of this disparity in experience, but the Vietnamese people did. And so I grew up with this distinct sense that storytelling was really crucial. Storytelling was absolutely crucial to how it is that every population, every people understand themselves. We tell stories about what America is in order to make America meaningful to us. But as a Vietnamese refugee, I understood that I and other Vietnamese people were not a part of this American story. We were an excuse for the American story to take place. So I grew up with this intention that one day I would become a storyteller, and that one day what I would try to do would be to tell some of these Vietnamese stories and to humanize these Vietnamese people who, in Hollywood movies about the Vietnam War, were dehumanized, and in American political and journalistic discourse were erased or served only as props for American concerns and American stories. And so this led me down the road to becoming a short story writer. And I started writing short stories because I thought, well, they're short. They must be easy to write. So I set down the first words of The Refugees in the summer of 1997 when I moved to LA. And now, 20 years later, you finally get the book, all right? So that is 20 years of sweat and pain and disappointment on my part that you can read in about 5 or 6 hours. So that's part of what it means to be a writer, is to suffer and for your art. No one asks us to do this. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying this is what happens. But it was how I learned to be a writer, because I didn't go to an MFA program or anything like that. I taught myself how to write through writing these short stories. And again, the point of it was to humanize Vietnamese people, a diversity of Vietnamese people. And it was really deliberate to title this collection The Refugees. It seemed appropriate last year, as my editor and I were trying to come up with a title, that the problem of refugees, which had been fundamental to my experience, was still fundamental to American preoccupations. So I want to read you just a page or so from the opening of The Refugees, and you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. It's a story called Black-Eyed Women. Fame would strike someone, usually the kind that healthy-minded people would not wish upon themselves, such as being kidnapped and kept prisoner for years, humiliated in a sex scandal, or surviving something typically fatal. These survivors needed someone to help write their memoirs, and their agents might eventually come across me. "At least your name's not on anything," my mother once said. When I mentioned that I would not mind being thanked in the acknowledgments, she said, "Let me tell you a story." It would be the first time I heard this story, but not the last. "In our homeland," she went on, "there was a reporter who said the government tortured the people in prison. So the government does to him exactly what he said they did to others. They send him away and no one ever sees him again. That's what happens to writers who put their names on things." My parents didn't say that to me, but they might as well have said that. That's perfectly in their character. By the time Victor Devoto chose me, I had resigned myself to being one of those writers whose names did not appear on book covers. His agent had given him a book that I had ghostwritten, its ostensible author the father of a boy who had shot and killed several people in his school. "I identify with the father's guilt," Victor said to me. He was the sole survivor of an airplane crash, 173 others having perished, including his wife and children. What was left of him appeared on all the talk shows, his body there, but not much else. The voice was a soft monotone, and the eyes, on the occasions they looked up, seemed to hold within them the silhouettes of mournful people. His publisher said that it was urgent that he finish his story while audiences still remembered the tragedy, and this was my preoccupation on the day my dead brother returned to me. My mother woke me while it was still dark outside and said, "Don't be afraid." Through my open door, the light from the hallway stung. Why would I be afraid? When she said my brother's name, I did not think of my brother. He had died long ago. I closed my eyes and said I did not know anyone by that name, but she persisted. "He's here to see us," she said, stripping off my covers and tugging at me until I rose, eyes half shut. She was 63, moderately forgetful, and when she led me to the living room and cried out, I was not surprised. "He was right here," she said, kneeling by her floral armchair as she felt the carpet. "It's wet." She crawled to the front door in her cotton pajamas, following the trail. When I touched the carpet, it was damp. For a moment, I twitched in belief, and the silence of the house at 4 a.m. felt ominous. Then I noticed a sound of rainwater in the gutters, and the fear that had gripped my neck relaxed its hold. My mother must have opened the door, gotten drenched, then come back inside. I knelt by her as she crouched next to the door, her hand on the knob, and said, "You're imagining things." "I know what I saw." Brushing my hand off her shoulder, she stood up, anger illuminating her dark eyes. "He walked. He talked. He wanted to see you." "Then where is he, Ma? I don't see anyone." "Of course you don't," she sighed, as if I were the one unable to grasp the obvious. "He's a ghost, isn't he?" So it's a ghost story, which is ironic because I hate ghost stories. I'm easily scared. But I grew up knowing that Vietnamese people literally believed in ghosts. This idea that ghosts would come and visit the living to pay their last respects was a widespread belief. And even if you didn't believe in those kinds of ghosts, what was evident to me is that the Vietnamese people were haunted. They were haunted by their past, by the traumas that they had undergone, and that the past, as Faulkner said, was not even past for them. I grew up in a community throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s that couldn't let go of that past, that was still obsessed by the war. And with every passing year, as this community, the first generation, aged and got older, the more they became aware that the younger generation, people like me and younger than me, were forgetting that past. And so it was not simply that they were being ignored by American society that concerned them. There was the fear that their own children would not know what had happened to them. And so that concern about being able to tell stories and being able to remember what had happened to people became even more urgent for me, which then eventually led me to write The Sympathizer. And when I wrote The Sympathizer, some of that concern about humanizing Vietnamese people was still with me. And I wanted to write a novel about the Vietnam War because even 40 years after the end of the Vietnam War, it seemed to me that the novel that I wanted to read about the Vietnam War hadn't yet been written. So I wanted to do something different with this book. And the book, even from the very premise, is different. It's about a communist spy in the South Vietnamese army in April 1975. And as Vietnam falls, or is about to be liberated, depending on your point of view, his mission is to flee with the remnants of that army to the United States and spy on their efforts to take their country back. And so it's a spy novel, historical novel, hopefully it's a black comedy, and it's based on true events. Most of the things that happened in this book really happened to Vietnamese people. And so the first episode that I'm going to read to you is about what happened to these Vietnamese refugees once they got to the United States. In my case, I went to Indiantown Gap. In this case, the refugees arrive at Camp Pendleton. And in this section, the narrator, the protagonist, is going to write a letter to his aunt in France telling her what has happened to these Vietnamese refugees. "If allowed to stay together," I told my aunt, "we could have incorporated ourselves into a respectably sized, self-sufficient colony, a pimple on the buttocks of the American body politic. Sufficiently collective to elect our own representative to the Congress and have a voice in our America. A little Saigon as delightful, delirious, and dysfunctional as the original, which was exactly why we were not allowed to stay together, but were instead dispersed by bureaucratic fiat. Wherever we found ourselves, we found each other. We did our best to conjure up the culinary staples of our culture, but since we were dependent on Chinese markets, our food had an unacceptably Chinese tinge. Another blow in the gauntlet of our humiliation that left us with the sweet and sour taste of unreliable memories. Just correct enough to evoke the past, just wrong enough to remind us that the past was forever gone, missing, along with the proper variety, subtlety, and complexity of our universal solvent, fish sauce. Oh, fish sauce, how we missed it, how nothing tasted right without it. This pungent liquid condiment of the darkest sepia hue was much denigrated by foreigners for its supposedly horrendous reek, lending new meaning to the phrase, "There's something fishy around here." For we were the fishy ones. We used fish sauce the way Transylvanian villagers wore cloves of garlic to ward off vampires. In our case, to establish a perimeter with those Westerners who could never understand that what was truly fishy was the nauseating stench of cheese. What was fermented fish compared to curdled milk? But out of deference to our hosts, we kept our feelings to ourselves, sitting close to one another on prickly sofas and scratchy carpets, our knees touching under crowded kitchen tables, chewing on dried squid and the cud of remembrance until our jaws ached, trading stories heard second and third hand about our scattered countrymen. This was the way we learned of the Klan, turned into slave labor by a farmer in Modesto, and the naive girl who flew to Spokane to marry her GI sweetheart and was sold to a brothel, and the widower with 9 children who went out into a Minnesotan winter and lay down in the snow on his back with mouth open until he was buried and frozen, and the regretful refugees on Guam who petitioned to go back to Vietnam, never to be heard from again, and the spoiled girl seduced by heroin who disappeared into the Baltimore streets, and the devout Buddhist who spanked his young son and was arrested for child abuse in Houston, and the husband who slapped his wife and was jailed for domestic violence in Raleigh, and the men who had escaped but left wives behind in the chaos, and the women who had escaped but left husbands behind, and the children who had escaped without parents and grandparents, and the families missing 1, 2, 3, or more children. Sifting through the dirt, we panned for gold, the story of the baby orphan adopted by a Kansas billionaire, or the mechanic who bought a lottery ticket in Arlington and became a multimillionaire, or the girl elected president of her high school class in Baton Rouge, or the boy accepted by Harvard from Fond du Lac, the soil of Camp Pendleton still in the tracks of his sneakers, or the movie star you love so much, dear aunt, who circled the world from airport to airport, no country letting her in after the fall of Saigon, none of her American movie star friends returning her desperate phone calls until, with her last dime, she snagged Tippi Hedren, who flew her to Hollywood. So it was that we soaked ourselves in sadness and we rinsed ourselves with hope. And for all that we believed in almost every rumor we heard, and for all that we believed almost every rumor we heard, almost all of us refused to believe that our nation was dead. So the Tippi Hedren story is a true story. The movie star is Kieu Jin. She was the most famous movie star of her generation. And Tippi Hedren encountered these Vietnamese refugees and wanted to help them. So she got her private manicurist to train some of these women in manicuring. And that is the origins of the story by which Vietnamese people have taken over 51% of the nail salon industry in this country. So that's either a pro-refugee story or an anti-refugee story, depending on your point of view. But something had happened to me from finishing The Refugees to writing The Sympathizer, and that was that something that had always bothered me about the refugees became clear to me, and that was this project of humanizing. I always wondered, why did I need to humanize Vietnamese people? Weren't we already human? Why did I need to prove our humanity to anyone? And at the time that I was writing the stories, I really didn't have a good answer for that, because I was simply trying to perfect or to master the technique of writing the stories. I couldn't really be worried about this problem of humanizing. But writing the novel, I no longer worried about the technical issues, and I could really think more about this problem of humanity. And it became very clear to me that the issue here was that if you are a part of the majority in any country, not just the United States but elsewhere, you don't have to prove your humanity to anyone. You take your humanity for granted. It's the people who are not in power, the minority, the weak, the marginal, the excluded, the immigrant, the refugee, the newcomer, who feels that they have to prove their humanity to you or to the majority or to the dominant class in a society. And that is a problem that affects literature, because Jonathan Franzen doesn't have to prove his humanity to anyone, right? He can write with the assumption that if he writes about Midwestern white people, everybody in the United States is going to know what he's talking about. And that means that he doesn't have to translate what he's doing for anyone. But minority writers who fear that their audiences will not know what they're talking about feel the need to translate. So for example, if I'm writing a book about Vietnamese people and I'm worried about translation, I will say pho, common, that delicious beef noodle soup that we all love to eat, right? But Vietnamese people would never have to say that to other Vietnamese people. So when you see translation happening in a text by a minority author, you know that that minority author is speaking to the majority, not to a person from her or his community. And that's a distortion in the literature that marks minority literature, that consigns itself to being minority literature. And with The Sympathizer, I decided I wasn't going to do that. I was not going to translate. And I had to figure out a way that I could write this book without translation. And so The Sympathizer is written as a confession from one Vietnamese person to another Vietnamese person. So of course, in that context, I don't have to explain what pho is, for example. But what I do have to explain is American culture. So the translation that happens in this book is American culture to Vietnamese people, which is what allows the book to defamiliarize American culture to American readers. And American readers are forced to become eavesdroppers, to be listening in on a conversation that they haven't been invited to, at least in the fiction of the book. And this was a really important, this was one of the most important decisions that I made, to structure the novel in this way, to put American readers into a position that they typically are not expected to assume. And the other thing that I decided was that I was done with trying to humanize Vietnamese people. Because in watching a film like Apocalypse Now, for example, and other Vietnam War movies made by Americans, what was really obvious was that these movies depicted Americans doing really terrible things. They were human, but they were also inhuman as well. And yet Americans who watch these movies are never in doubt about their own humanity. They would never assume that what these American soldiers do is representative of all Americans. And that is a privilege of being a part of the majority. Because when you're a part of the minority and you realize that you don't get the privilege of making 100 movies or writing 100 books, you get one movie, you get one book that other people are going to watch or read, a tremendous weight is put upon that book or that movie. And the impulse for many minority writers or artists is not to show their own community in a negative light, not to show them doing bad things. Because the fear is, if they do, then the rest of the people, the majority, will think, all of you people are like that. That's a weakness. And so I wanted to write a book in which my protagonist would be as inhuman as any American anti-hero that was out there. Because to be human and inhuman at the same time is the privilege of a complex subjectivity, of being a fully rounded human being capable of good as well as evil. And to only be human is actually a sign of being condescended to, right? Because your full-fledged complexity is not being acknowledged. And so my narrator is a spy, he's a liar, he's an alcoholic, he's a womanizer, he's a traitor, and he's a murderer. Thankfully, it's not autobiographical. Okay? Except for maybe the alcoholic part. But that was a really important decision to make, that this was going to be a novel about inhumanity as much as humanity, and it would be a novel that would confront Americans rather than translate to them. And so you'll see some of this in this next passage. One of the things that he has to do when he arrives in Southern California is get a job. And one of the jobs that he gets is to become the authenticity consultant on the making of a movie that looks suspiciously like Apocalypse Now. But really, it's a compendium of all of these Vietnam War movies that I had seen. So in this scene, he goes and he visits the director of this movie for the first time, and the director is known only as the auteur. My meeting with the auteur had gone on for a while longer, mostly in a more subdued fashion, with me pointing out that the lack of speaking parts for Vietnamese people in a movie set in Vietnam might be interpreted as cultural insensitivity. Do you not think it would be a little more believable, I said, a little more realistic, a little more authentic, for a movie set in a certain country, for the people in that country to have something to say, instead of having your screenplay direct, as it does now, cut to villagers speaking in their own language? Do you think it might not be decent to let them actually say something, instead of simply acknowledging that there's some kind of sound coming from their mouths? Could you not even just have them speak a heavily accented English? You know what I mean, Ching Chong English? Just to pretend they're speaking in an Asian language that somehow American audiences can strangely understand? The auteur grimaced and said, "Very interesting. Great stuff. Loved it. But I had a question. What was it? Oh, yes. How many movies have you made? None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. Nothing. And however you say it in your language. So thank you for telling me how to do my job. Now get the hell out of my house and come back after you've made a movie or two. Maybe then I'll listen to one or two of your cheap ideas." A lot of Hollywood people since writing this book, and none of them dispute this characterization. I confess to being angry with the auteur. But was I wrong in being angry? This was especially the case when he acknowledged he did not even know that Montagnard was simply a French catch-all term for the dozens of Highland minorities. The movie's titled The Hamlet, and it's about American Green Berets who go to the Highlands in Vietnam and rescue these so-called Montagnards. What if, I said to him, I wrote a screenplay about the American West and simply called all the natives Indians? You'd want to know whether the cavalry was fighting the Navajo or Apache or Comanche, right? Likewise, I would want to know, when you say these people are Montagnards, whether we speak of the Bru or the Nung or the Tay. Let me tell you a secret, the auteur said. You ready? Here it is. No one gives a shit. He was amused by my wordlessness. To see me without words is like seeing one of those Egyptian felines without hair, a rare and not necessarily desirable occasion. How could I be so dense? How could I be so deluded? I naively believed that I could divert the Hollywood organism from its goal, the simultaneous lobotomization and pickpocketing of the world's audiences. Hollywood did not just make horror movie monsters, it was its own horror movie monster, smashing me under its foot. I had failed, and the auteur would make the Hamlet as he intended, with my countrymen serving merely as raw material for an epic about white men saving good yellow people from bad yellow people. I pitied the French for their naivete in believing they had to visit a country in order to exploit it. Hollywood was much more efficient, inventing the countries it wanted to exploit. I was maddened by my helplessness before the auteur's imagination and machinations. His arrogance marked something new in the world, for this was the first war where the losers would write history instead of the victors, courtesy of the most efficient propaganda machine ever created, with all due respect to Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis who never achieved global domination. Hollywood's high priests understood innately the observation of Milton's Satan, that it was better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. Better to be villain, loser, or anti-hero, rather than virtuous extra, so long as one commanded the bright lights of center stage. In this forthcoming Hollywood trompe-l'oeil, all the Vietnamese of any side would come out poorly, herded into the roles of the poor, the innocent, the evil, or the corrupt. Our fate was not to be merely mute. We were to be struck dumb. So that was my revenge on Hollywood. Just took 30 years or so to get around to doing it. And I'm going to end with one last scene that is also about popular culture, but from a different direction. And one of the things about Vietnamese people, or at least Southern Vietnamese people, at least to me, besides the fact that we like being sad and melancholic, is that we also like to sing and dance and drink and smoke. So these Vietnamese refugees, after leaving Camp Pendleton and moving to Los Angeles, one of the first things that they did was to open a nightclub. That's a true story. And this is where the next scene takes place. And it's very much about memory and forgetting. Because again, it seemed to me that the Vietnamese that I knew were steeped in memory and forgetting, and in the problem of how much to remember and how much to forget. And in that sense, they weren't that different from other Americans around them, at least when it came to the Vietnam War, where this problem of memory and forgetting has been endemic for Americans as well. So our protagonist goes to this nightclub, he sees this young woman there, and she is the one woman he should not fall in love with, for she is the boss of his daughter, the general. See, I just did this last night. I'm a little confused. She is the daughter of his boss, the general. There you go. I was having this conversation with UC Irvine students at lunch today, and I was talking about my novel, and I forgot details from my novel. It's like that character named Professor what? I had to, and the students had to remind me what the details of my own book were. All right. Now known by just one name, like John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Mary, Lana stepped on stage, clad in a red velvet bustier, a leopard print miniskirt, black lace gloves, and thigh-high leather boots with stiletto heels. My heart would have paused at the boots, the heels, or the flat, smooth slice of her belly, naked in between miniskirt and bustier. But the combination of all three arrested my heart altogether and beat it with the vigor of a Los Angeles police squad. They don't laugh about that in LA. But I know you like laughing about that. Pouring cognac over my heart freed it, but thus drenched, it was easily flambéed by her torch song. She turned on the heat with her first number, the unexpected "I'd love you to want me," which I'd heard before sung only by men. "I'd love you to want me" was the theme song of the bachelors and unhappily married males of my generation, whether in the English original or the equally superb French and Vietnamese renditions. What the song expressed so perfectly, from lyric to melody, was unrequited love. And we men of the South love nothing more than unrequited love. Cracked hearts, our primary weakness after cigarettes, coffee, and cognac. Listening to Lana sing, all I wanted was to immolate myself in a night with her to remember forever and ever. Every man in the room shared my emotion as we watched her do no more than sway at the microphone, her voice enough to move the audience, or rather, to still us. Nobody talked and nobody stirred, except to raise a cigarette or a glass. An utter concentration, not broken, for her next, slightly more upbeat number, bang, bang, my baby shot me down. Lana's version of bang, bang layered English with French and Vietnamese. The last line of the French version echoed Pham Dui's Vietnamese version, "We will never forget." In the pantheon of classic pop songs from Saigon, this tricolor rendition was one of the most memorable, masterfully weaving together love and violence in the enigmatic story of two lovers who, regardless of having known each other since childhood, or because of knowing each other since childhood, shoot each other down. Bang Bang was the sound of memory's pistol firing into our heads, for we could not forget love. We could not forget war. We could not forget lovers. We could not forget enemies. We could not forget home. And we could not forget Saigon. We could not forget the caramel flavor of iced coffee with coarse sugar, the bowls of noodle soup eaten while squatting on the sidewalk, the strumming of a friend's guitar while we swayed on hammocks under coconut trees, the whisper of a dewy lover saying the most seductive words in our language, "An ơi." The working men who slept in their ciclos on the streets, kept warm only by the memories of their families. The refugees who slept on every sidewalk of every city. The sweetness and firmness of a mango plucked fresh from its tree. The girls who refused to talk to us and who we only pined for more. The men who had died or disappeared. The streets and homes blown away by bombshells. The streams where we swam naked and laughing. The secret grove where we spied on the nymphs who bathed and splashed with the innocence of the birds. The shadows cast by candlelight on the walls of wattled huts, the barking of a hungry dog in an abandoned village, the appetizing reek of the fresh durian one wept to eat, the sight and sound of orphans howling by the dead bodies of their mothers and fathers, the stickiness of one's shirt by afternoon, the stickiness of one's lover by the end of lovemaking, the stickiness of our situations. And while the list could go on and on and on, the point was simply this: the most important thing we could never forget was that we could never forget. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and I think now we have some time for questions, which is actually always my favorite part of the night.
Absolutely.
Right over there.
It seems to me, I've been reading The Sympathizer. I've also listened to some podcasts and so on, and in tonight's talk, that Ralph Ellison had a huge influence on me. It seems to me that you've been engaged in kind of a meditation about an invisible man, a minority member of society. So could you speak to that?
The question was about Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man and its influence on me and my novel, and how my novel is responding or in conversation with his book, and that's absolutely right. I read Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man when I was in college, and it made an enormous impact on me because of its aesthetic power, and because, as you say, it's about an invisible man. It's very particular to African Americans, but I felt that, being a minority in this country, this problem of invisibility, alternating with hypervisibility, was in fact a universal condition. We're invisible for most of the time until some kind of crisis makes us hyper-visible. And as a Vietnamese American and as a Vietnamese refugee, that seemed to me to be about right. Americans saw right through Vietnamese people, except for the moment when American culture turned Vietnamese people into stereotypes and blew them up on the big screen. I mean, in both the sense of making them larger than life and then literally blowing them up as well. And so when I wrote the Sympathizer, the Invisible Man was one of the closest models for me, because what Ellison did in that book was to take the story of an anonymous everyman and turn his journey of identity, disillusionment, discovery, and politicization into an allegory for all of African American culture, but also with implications universal. I mean, African American culture, already universal, but with implications for people who are not African Americans as well. That this journey of the Invisible Man could be felt by people who weren't African Americans as well. So in this novel, I wanted to have an anonymous everyman whose journey could also serve as an allegory for the Vietnamese people and what they'd gone through, but would also be hopefully a story that would allow identification from others as well, who might find in his story of being constantly divided between opposing sides and finding himself in a position of never being able to make the completely right choice, to find in that tragedy something that they could identify with as well. Yes. Hi, Anita.
Hi, I wanted to say this is like a 400-page, beautiful poem of rage. It's just amazing. But my question being, you didn't use quotation marks anywhere here, and it reminds me a little bit of Arundhati Roy's A Lot of Small Things. One of the things about that amazing novel was, oh wow, well she's breaking all the rules of grammar. So what made you delete those?
Okay.
And it's completely I understand who's talking, I don't need those.
Okay, so the first comment was actually, this seems like a poem of rage, which I like that description of the novel because I did deliberately read a lot of poetry while I was writing this book, because I wanted to pay attention to not just issues of the narrative and characterization and whatever, but also to the sentence level effect of what the reader was experiencing. And so it was really useful to look at poetry with an intense focus on imagery, because I wanted my own sentences to be approximating that as well. Rage, yes, very definitely. I was very angry when I wrote this book. I should have been angry for most of my life, but I keep it kind of well hidden under this very polite veneer. And is my rage reduced? I would say, when I was in college, I was very passionately angry as I went to Berkeley. Okay, I guess this is affirming a stereotype of Berkeley for Southern Californians, but it's true. I went to Berkeley and I was radicalized, and I was like, oh, damn you, white society, for doing this to me and erasing my experience from history, and but I learned how to temper that. Because in order to survive as a professor, you can't go around being angry. You're not going to last. You have to figure out. So the rage became, it went from being a fire to being a pilot light. It was always on, but it was never so hot that it would make other people uncomfortable. But I could turn it on and turn it higher when I needed to. And that's what happened in the Sympathizer. When I wrote the book, like I said, I was not going to translate. And the corollary with translation for minority writers in this country is not only do we have to translate, or we are expected to translate, but we're expected to accommodate, we're expected to apologize, and we're expected to cater to the expectations of the dominant readership. And I said, no, I'm angry and I'm going to show it. But hopefully in a funny way, right? And then the other comment was, why are there no quotation marks in this book? And I have to tell you, this is a very common criticism. It's remarkable to me how many American readers are bothered by the fact that there are no quotation marks in this book. Okay, even more so than squid sex. There's a certain percentage of readers who they reach that moment with a squid and they're like, no, I'm not going to continue with this book. So if you get past that point, which is only about 20% of the way into the book, congratulations. But the no quotation marks, I read a lot, and thank you for bringing up Arundhati Roy, that she doesn't use quotation marks either. And I'm like, if Arundhati Roy can do it, why can't I? But another major source of influence for me was European modernist literature. And the Europeans have no problem not using quotation marks. Okay? And as I wrote the novel, I really thought of it as a European version of an American novel. Because I look at contemporary American fiction and I find it kind of boring. You know, that for me, contemporary American fiction is dominated by middle-brow literary realism. And all of that is not interesting for me. I like the highbrow and I like the lowbrow. Like, I like genre fiction of all kinds, and I like the highbrow, modernist, experimental kind of stuff. But sort of the middle-brow, conventional, you know, don't provoke people formally, not interesting. And realism, which is marked by those quotation marks, which is not realistic. We don't go around doing this all the time, you know, but somehow that's realistic on the page as a convention. You know, realism was not an adequate mode either, because it was, you know, there are plenty of realistic novels written about the refugee experience, the immigrant experience, the Vietnam War, and while those are all useful and good, there's also something inadequate about them for me too, because they're dominated by this aesthetic of show, don't tell. This is what they teach people in MFA programs. Show, don't tell, as if this brand of realism is a universal aesthetic. It's like a rule handed down from God saying, show, don't tell, which totally prevents you from realizing that actually for much of human history, art has been about telling as much as showing, or telling more than showing. That didacticism has served an important aesthetic purpose. And so my novel is really about showing and telling, and the telling is what allows me to make certain kinds of political points. So that was one of the reasons why I stripped away the quotation marks. And then the other reason was, this guy is under, if you read to the end of the book, you realize he's under high duress as he is writing this confession. So excuse him for not always following the rules of grammar. Yeah. Okay, so, yeah.
Given how the world has changed for us here in the United States in the last week or so, I wonder if artists are radicals. I might have gotten on tweet on that, tweet about that wonderful article you had in the LA Times. And I know your character had to deal with almost like, he could hold two realities or two almost like truths. What's your viewpoint on almost like a new reality that we have to face? What is fact now? Fiction? Do we believe the media? Do we believe only people we encounter face to face? Maybe from your unique perspective, coming from another culture, and actually that might actually give you clear insight into where we're headed and how you perceive this, for lack of a better term, reality.
Well, I think this is one of the reasons why, to refer to the refugees, it was important to title that book The Refugees, and it's been important for me to take the opportunity whenever I can to say that I'm not an immigrant, I'm a refugee. Because in American society, we know how to deal with immigrants. Now, sometimes we may be pro-immigrant, or nowadays it seems we're turning anti-immigrant. But this has been a pendulum that American society has swung back and forth between. Because immigrants are reconcilable with the American dream. They affirm the American dream, right? But refugees are threatening to the American dream because they're the unwanted. And they remind Americans that everything that Americans take for granted in the American dream is one catastrophe away from being destroyed. And I think it's even beyond the xenophobia and everything else that's directed against refugees. I think this is one of the key reasons why many countries, not just the United States, is fearful of refugees. And why today, you know, there's this rhetoric now of the necessity of building walls, which I completely oppose. You know, we should be building bridges rather than building walls. We should be opening hearts rather than closing doors. Right? And I realize that not everybody may agree with me in this room or outside of this space, but for writers and artists, that's the premise of what we do. You know, if we closed our hearts and built walls, we could never write poetry, we could never write books, because our entire being, our entire task is to imagine what it's like to be someone else. And if you imagine what it's like to be someone else, you can't shut the door in their face. All right? So it's important as a writer to keep asserting for myself my status as a refugee, and to advocate as strongly as I can for other refugees. You know, it's one of the worst ironies is to be a refugee who turns against other refugees. so far as a sympathizer in our present political situation, the protagonist, as you say, is a man torn between two sides. He sympathizes with everybody, and yet as a revolutionary, he feels a need to make a commitment. And this is his tragedy, but it's the tragedy of all revolutions. This is partly what makes the novel universal. All revolutionaries face this dilemma. They become revolutionaries because of their capacity for empathy with the poor and the oppressed and so on, right? But then to be a revolutionary, you have to shut down the empathy in order to do the terrible things that make a revolution succeed. And what happens in the novel is that he realizes that what makes a situation a tragedy is not the conflict between right and wrong, but between right and right. That two opposing sides both believe with their utter convictions that they are right. And that sounds like what we have today in American society, right? So I don't have an easy answer to your question, except to say maybe we're living in the middle of a tragedy at this point, no matter what side of the divide you occupy, right? Because even if we're capable of exercising empathy for people who are not like us, which I think we should do, at a certain point, we still have to make political decisions and political commitments that might prevent us from carrying out that empathy for people we disagree with. That's politics. And so I think that what I'm trying to say is that at the same time that those of us who occupy one side of a partisan divide really do need to go out there and physically meet and talk to people who are not like us ideologically and try to understand them, and conversely try to make them understand us, at a certain point we also have to make a decision. And hopefully we can keep our country together at the same time. Yeah. In the back? Yeah.
Hi. As a Vietnamese American woman, I want to let you know how much I appreciate your book. It's the first time I've ever seen myself in any work of fiction. So thank you for that. And my question is, in trying to understand my parents' generation, I'm curious if your parents have read your book and what their thoughts are.
Yeah. The squid scene might be awkward to have a conversation about. Once the question was, what do my parents think about my writing? And once one of my stories was translated into Vietnamese, one of my short stories, The Other Man in Here, it's about a Vietnamese refugee who comes to San Francisco in 1975 and is sent to live with two sponsors, men, who turn out to be gay lovers. And our Vietnamese refugee discovers that he too is gay. So I gave my dad that story. My dad is a devout Catholic. Never heard from him again about that story. And so likewise, they have not read this novel, and we have not talked about the novel, interestingly enough. I think he probably knows what the premise is because the premise has been discussed in the Vietnamese media. So there's just a sort of polite silence around my writing in my household, which I'm okay with. I don't need my parents to read my stuff. They've done enough for me, much less I want them to spend more time, reading these things that I've written. But I'll tell you that when I won the Pulitzer Prize, I didn't call my dad and tell him about it. We're modest people, It's expected that I win the Pulitzer Prize. Yeah, so what? And it's not. When I was in school, if I got an A, I never told my dad about it. But when I got a B, he would be concerned. So anyway, I find out I'm on the road on book tour, and then 2 days later I'm in Philadelphia, and he calls me. And he says, "Hey, our relatives in Vietnam called, and they said you won the Pulitzer Prize." And he was so happy. He was actually giddy with joy. I've never heard him so happy. And that was enough for me. I think there was, yes, over there.
I'm just curious, Vietnamese who have moved to the U.S. within the last 20 or 30 years, would you characterize them as being refugees or immigrants, and how were they integrating with the Vietnamese community that was here previously?
Yeah. So in the last 20 or 30 years, new Vietnamese people have shown up who might have come through immigration channels versus fleeing as refugees, and how might they fit in with the previous waves who were mostly refugees, right? And I think that's interesting. I think that, in the past 40 years or so that Vietnamese people have mostly been here in this country, the politics and culture has been dominated by the refugees and their concerns, the things that I've talked about. And that has meant that, public discourse has been dominated by anti-communism, right? But many of these new immigrants who have come are coming as economic immigrants, or they're coming as foreign students. And many of these foreign students, international students, are actually the children of Communist Party cadre. And the Vietnamese American community is still so dominated by refugees that the voices of these immigrants or these international students hasn't really made its presence felt, I think, because the Vietnamese language media is based in communities that are dominated by the anti-communists. So all I'm trying to say is that the community is increasingly diverse, but it's still dominated in public by the sentiments of the refugees.
And I think we have time for one more question.
One more question, okay. Yes, in the back.
Given that man is capable of humane and inhumane actions, what do you believe? Do you believe we are at the core humane or inhumane?
Wow, you want to end on a high note. Yeah. Well, in both The Sympathizer and in Nothing Ever Dies, I get into that question, and then The Sympathizer is a dramatic explanation of the thing that I argue very explicitly for in Nothing Ever Dies. And in Nothing Ever Dies, one of the things I want to think about is, how is it possible that we as a society rationally know that war is hell, and yet with every generation we go to war again? And I think the answer for me is that we believe in our own humanity. That when we say war is hell, when I say we, I don't just mean Americans, and I think this is true of many societies. When we say war is hell, we mean that it's the other country, the other side, that makes it hell. They do the inhuman things. And therefore, if we do anything inhuman, it's only in response to them. So war is always a humane action on our part. Right. And that's why we can go to war again and again and again, because we remain convinced of our humanity. And we deny the inhumanity that we may do as an exception or something that has been provoked. But in actuality, I think we are both human and inhuman at the same time. And sometimes that inhumanity is manifest very graphically, in war, in combat, in atrocities and things like that. But I think actually the much more disturbing thing, and the thing that we really don't want to think about, is that our inhumanity is expressed daily through complicity, through passivity, through resignation. That even if we don't agree with something that our society is doing, we think our society is doing something unjust, we may not do anything about it, right? And that is the worst kind of inhumanity, is taking comfort in our own security and ignoring the inhuman things that we collectively have endorsed as a society. And only by recognizing that capacity for inhumanity do we actually have the potential for trying to prevent wars in the future. So paradoxically, that idea of saying we're all human, we should all just get along, won't work. We have to say we're all human and inhuman, recognizing our weaknesses and our flaws. And that sort of realism is the necessary step towards any kind of lasting peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and book sales and signing up here at the front. Thank you for coming.